Okay, so let's dive right into this explainer. Imagine trying to capture the birth of a nation on film. When a country is born out of a literal, brutal conflict, the stories it tells about that war on the big screen, they aren't just popcorn entertainment. They are the actual building blocks of its national identity. But what happens when the underlying politics of that nation start to shift? Well, the stories shift right along with them. Today, we're going to unpack exactly why and how Bangladeshi war narratives changed so radically over a 40-year period, specifically looking at the cinematic memory of the 1971 Liberation War. Check out this absolutely wild quote from a filmmaker back in 2009. They were told by the censor board to literally cut a scene just because it showed a freedom fighter begging. I mean, that perfectly hooks us into the incredible political stakes of historical memory, right? It shows us that even decades later, the official narrative demands flawless heroes and a completely spotless history. It totally sets the stage for our central question today. Why do these war narratives change so drastically depending on who's looking through the lens? Before we get into the weeds here, let's just quickly establish a couple of key terms you're going to need to know. The 1970 war, the one that separated East Pakistan from West Pakistan to create the independent nation of Bangladesh, is called the Mukti Juddo. And crucially, the term Rajakar refers to the enemy within, basically Bengalis who collaborated with the Pakistani state against the independence movement. Definitely keep these two terms in mind, because the way these factions are portrayed is at the very heart of this whole cinematic shift.
To really grasp this shift, let's map out our timeline real quick. We're going to anchor our journey between two monumental films released on opposite sides of a 4-decade pendulum swing. So we start with the 1947 partition of India, which created a two-wing Pakistan. Then the 1971 Liberation War shatters that arrangement. Just months after the war ended, in 1972, this incredibly gritty film called Aura Agaro John, or They Are 11, comes out. Then, fast forward 40 years to 2011, and the highly polished, super controversial film Mayor John hits theaters.
Just looking at the sheer contrast between these two film posters highlights how the entire narrative evolved. We're talking a shift from raw, trauma-driven post-war cinema straight into a polished, globalized aesthetic. The Aura Agaro John poster shows these armed, intense men practically born from the immediate ashes of battle, whereas Maher John presents the stylized, almost dreamy vibe. And that contrast, it isn't just visual. It represents a fundamental, ground-up change in how the nation remembers its own pain.
All right, let's get into part 1, 1972, Cinema in the Ashes. Literally imagine trying to make a movie about a war when the smoke hasn't even cleared from your streets. What's genuinely astounding here is that they used real war veterans, actual live ammo, and, get this, blew up a real damaged bridge to simulate a war that had just ended months prior. The film's producer, Masood Pardes, gathered stories directly from actual veterans. The military was so cooperative that having live ammunition on set wasn't even a big deal, mostly because, as Parvez noted, everybody already had weapons in their hands anyway. That is a level of immediate, gritty realism you are just not going to see in modern Hollywood.
Now, they didn't have a massive budget or filmic documentation of the actual war to pull from, so to compensate, director Chashni Nazrul Islam seamlessly spliced actual documentary newsreels of dogfights right into the fictional story. Since they were moving so fast, they used stock footage of aerial bombardment, some of it looking like it was pulled straight out of World War II or Vietnam, and because the original film reels have aged into this gray, tinted black and white over the years, those documentary inserts end up blending almost flawlessly with the studio scenes. It's like a patchwork of reality. They even embedded fresh footage of Indian soldiers right there in Dhaka, capturing the immediate historical reality before future political regimes could swoop in and change the official narrative. You see, as the political pendulum swung in Bangladesh in the decades that followed, acknowledging the role of external forces like India in the war became highly sensitive. But back in 1972, that raw footage was just a reflection of recent reality. It captured a moment in time before the history books became heavily filtered. Which brings us to part 2. 2011, and the post-war generation. Jumping ahead 40 years, the generational memory of the war passes on to a completely new group of storytellers equipped with totally different tools. This is where we see that looking glass effect really take hold. The people making the films now, they didn't fight in the war, they inherited stories about it. And the contrast is night and day. The cardboard sets and live ammo of the 1970s completely give way to the polished, Bollywood-influenced color schemes of 2011. Director Rubaiyat Hossain, who was actually born a decade after the war ended, drew upon her family's memories to craft Maher John. She used a production team heavily influenced by the modern advertising industry, and even brought in international actors from India and Pakistan. that signaled a confident, globalized ambition that was entirely absent back in 1972. So you have this new generation, raised on high-end advertising aesthetics, reconstructing a highly stylized, vintage look of a war they never personally fought in. And, it's beautiful, for sure, but it fundamentally changes the texture of the memory. It transports the war from a visceral, lived trauma into this beautifully curated, almost glossy historical drama. And that brings us to a really fascinating mystery. How, and more importantly, why, did the face of the enemy completely transform in the eyes of these filmmakers? In 1972, the villains looked one way, but by 2011, they had morphed into something entirely different. To understand why Bangladeshi war narratives changed so deeply, we have to look closely at the country's shifting relationship with religion. That takes us to part 3, shifting views on piety. For a long time after the war, Islamic piety was politically associated with the Pakistani state. That meant it was incredibly difficult to portray a pious Muslim as a hero in a Bangladeshi war film. So, as a result, in 1972, the primary villain was basically a literal monster. We're talking a hollow-eyed, underlit Pakistani soldier framed exactly like a horror movie demon. The cinematography intentionally distorts his features to make him look totally inhuman. In this early cinematic era, the Pakistani soldier was just a one-dimensional terror, and the local Bengali collaborators, the Rajakars, were often depicted wearing very specific religious attire to immediately signal their treason to the audience. But look at how this brilliantly illustrates the shift over 40 years. We go from a comedic, treacherous local sidekick to a sophisticated, politically neutral patriarch. In 1972, the character Bigar Ali is the sycophantic, cartoonish villain. Fast forward to 2011's Meherjan, and we meet Nana Jan, played by Victor Banerjee. He is an elite, highly educated Muslim who absolutely refuses to support the Pakistani army, but he also kind of keeps his distance from the liberation fighters. He's complex, he's melancholic, and he's deeply rooted in a much longer pluralist history. As the political pendulum swung over the decades, the cinematic space finally, slowly opened up to allow for sympathetic, complex Muslim figures who completely defied those simple wartime binaries. Over 40 years, the collective social approach to Islamic piety in Bangladesh evolved. The audience was finally ready, or at least the filmmakers felt they were ready, to explore characters who loved their religion but didn't necessarily conflate it with the existence of the Pakistani state. It allowed for a much richer, albeit way more controversial, historical tapestry. Now, just as the villains evolved, we have to ask how the passage of time transformed the on-screen role of the survivors. Specifically, the women who survived the war's deepest traumas. And honestly, this is perhaps the most profound shift in the entire Looking Glass War. Let's get into part 4, the changing role of women. Okay, let's dive into this stark contrast. In the immediate aftermath of 1971, the trauma experienced by women was heavily mythologized, but often in a way that totally stripped them of their own voice. Early cinema essentially erased the agency of assaulted women by portraying them as tragic martyrs, whereas the 2011 film gave us rule-breaking women actively seeking revenge and exploring taboo romances. In Ora Egaro Joan, a female survivor is shown hanging herself. Her trauma is basically presented as a void that the male heroes then have to avenge. But in Meherjan, we see a radically different approach. The women aren't just sitting around waiting to be saved or mourned. One character actively takes up weapons for revenge, and the film even centers on a highly taboo consensual romance between a Bengali woman and a Pakistani soldier, really exploring the immense, messy complexities of survival and agency. So the absolutely crucial point here is that this cinematic shift didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the direct result of decades of hard-fought feminist organizing that fundamentally changed the social fabric of Bangladesh. Activists consistently challenged the post-war shaming of survivors. They elevated the term Birangona, which means war heroine, actively dislodging the old, toxic narrative that a woman's life ended with wartime assault. By the time Meherjan was made in 2011, the cultural groundwork had been laid to show women freed of those traditional constraints, acting as fierce truth-tellers rather than just passive victims. I want to leave you with this really powerful thought from scholar Nayanika Mukherjee. She describes a nation brought together through pain rather than victory. As cinema acts as a mirror, reflecting our changing politics, our evolving views on religion, and the hard-won progress of social movements, what does your own nation's film industry reveal about the pain that binds your history together? It's an incredible reminder that the stories we tell about our past are never really fixed. They are constantly being rewritten by the people looking through the glass today. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the narratives on your screen.